What does it mean to be an activist? I think to be an activist, a real activist, is to be a leader, a sovereign individual, someone who's not worried about identity. When you decide that you're in charge of your own life, that you have a role to play in shaping the world around you, that your life has value and importance, that things like justice and truth are important, when you invest your hope in yourself and in your community, instead of investing it in politicians and activist heroes, realizing that those heroes are actually just people. And the best kind of leader is the type of person who inspires those who are not currently leaders to become leaders. And leadership is something that we desperately need. Activism is something that we desperately need. We need people who are not only able to diagnose our social ills, but also able to treat them. These are the medicines that we have at our disposal. Lifestyle activism, theater activism, education activism, electoral activism, lobbying, direct action. Now, one thing that I'm often frustrated by in activist circles, particularly in radical politics, is that people get into semantic arguments about which activism is the real activism, or is the best form of activism, or the true form of activism. But this is an incomplete and myopic way to view our struggle. Each of these different forms of activism has its limitations, and each has its own strengths. Now, lifestyle activism. Lifestyle activism is the kind of activism that's preferred by folks who are generally ignorant about politics, and as a result feel totally disenfranchised from the systems of power. Buying organic food, wearing sweatshop-free clothes, eating a vegan diet, these are all noble things to do. Changing your diet to include more local food in it is absolutely a noble, respectable thing to do. Some people don't have that luxury, and to make it into a moral issue is really unfair. For instance, there are neighborhoods in which you cannot buy romaine lettuce. In some parts of Chicago, you cannot buy a carrot, let alone a local carrot. You cannot find fresh produce. There are food deserts throughout our urban communities. People living there often don't have the luxury of eating a vegan diet, or not a vegan diet that's healthy. Riding your bike instead of taking your car, or getting rid of your car, will save you money, but 3/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions come from industrial use, burning coal in order to create electricity. And more than half of that electricity goes to private industry, factories, power plants. Interestingly, nuclear power requires quite a bit of electricity. That's right, nuclear power requires the consumption of electricity, which comes from burning coal. So riding your bike will save you money, but it's not going to change that. What lifestyle activism can do is it can start important conversations with members of your community, people in your neighborhood, about why you're doing the things that you're doing, and about what's wrong. It allows you to be an example for others to follow. Theater activism. Now, this is the form of activism that most of us are probably most familiar with. We go to protests, we hold signs, we give speeches, we chant chants, we get into the media. The term theater activism makes it sound like it's phony, but it's not. It's an important tool in the toolbox. Theater activism is not unimportant. In fact, it's very crucial for building movements. Theater activism raises awareness about your issue. It builds momentum. It brings people together into one place, and then networking starts happening. People start building community. They start building power structures. And then from there, you can start moving towards doing more organizing, education, outreach, and perhaps even electoral work down the road. Which brings us to the next form of activism, education. Now, education activism can be as simple as just having casual conversations with people that you know. Or it can be as concerted an effort as going door to door in your community, canvassing people and talking about an issue you're passionate about, having 1,000 conversations. It can be standing on a street corner. It could be standing on a street corner handing out pamphlets all day. It could be making YouTube videos. And I'm sure you can think of plenty more examples. Education activism is important. It also builds momentum, makes people aware of an issue, and from there you can start building power. Electoral activism. Electoral activism is another important tool in the activist toolbox. Now, there's a lot of people who think that electoral activism is the end-all, be-all to activism, and I think that's simply false. The type of people who think that electoral activism is the end-all, be-all to activism are often partisan jerks who think that everybody should vote Democrat, even if the Democrat is as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than the Republican in the race. Now, Cindy Sheehan engaged in electoral activism when she ran as a Green Party candidate against Nancy Pelosi. Many of us wanted and still would like to see George W. Bush and Dick Cheney stand trial for war crimes. Nancy Pelosi refused to move forward on impeachment proceedings, and Nancy Pelosi continued to vote to authorize funding for the illegal and immoral wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Cindy Sheehan wanted to call her out for being a two-faced phony, which she is. So Cindy Sheehan ran against Nancy Pelosi in 2006. Ralph Nader was sick of seeing his former allies, the Democratic Party, moving further and further towards the right and becoming more and more buddies with the corporatocracy. And that is the reason why he ran for president in 1996. In 2000, in 2004, and 2008. A lot of people also see electoral activism as being the antithesis to activism because it's a sapping of energy. I also disagree with this. Electoral activism, when done right, is a good way to activate the grassroots. As part of my campaign, I'm going door to door and having conversations with people one-on-one about the issues that I care about. This is a great way to build solidarity with the community. It's also a great way to build momentum towards getting real things achieved on those issues. When the two major parties play this game of false opposition and they push through a worse and worse corporate agenda, it drives voter turnout down, which means that they can do less and less to get elected. And in the United States, we have no minimum turnout requirement. I also think that not voting is a really terrible strategy, and you can view that video by clicking on this box right here. So this 50% plus one strategy allows the Democrats and Republicans to be extremely lazy. What they do is they target their resources onto those who are most likely to turn out, which is that, as I've talked about before, that 40% of people who will vote Democrat or Republican no matter what every election. And it leaves the 60% of Americans who maybe wouldn't turn out to vote because they don't feel they have a horse in the race. They're just ignored. And this especially affects low-income people. It especially affects, people of color, new Americans who are recent citizens. For those populations, voter turnout is often lower. So adding a third party into the mix forces the candidates to do more work and get out into the community. It's often the case that Democrats here in Maine will rely on their institutional momentum and just do a few flyers and then rely on the fact that they have a D next to their name to carry them into office rather than doing grassroots work. Having a third-party candidate in the race forces those two mainstream parties to work, to activate their bases, and also to listen to disenfranchised communities. And then, hopefully, if you're organizing your communities in a post-election frame of mind, you're also getting them to pay attention to what these people are doing once they're elected. And then you have the ability to hold them accountable for what they did or didn't do in the next election cycle. And there's some things that direct action simply can't achieve, such as instituting a statewide single-payer system. There are some things that make concrete differences in people's lives that we do need government for. For those things, I do think that we should run candidates ourselves to get into office and make those things happen, as well as we try to create this autonomous, decentralized, more horizontal, more egalitarian society, as we try to create that world, the old system of government is going to try to crush it. And we've seen that since last September, over and over and over again. How as we begin building that new world and making it a real possibility, making it tangible, that the state comes in and crushes it. So we also need to be in government to prevent that from happening. Lobbying. And once you get your candidates into office, you have to hold them accountable. Or maybe there's people in office who disagree with you and you would like to change their mind. You can do this through lobbying. I know lobbying it's a dirty word, right? But It's not a bad thing if you're doing it. Lobbying is basically just another word for talking to them. I myself have lobbied as a citizen. I've lobbied for a few bills in the Maine State House, and I wasn't hired by any organization. I was just a concerned person. And a lot of people think that if you go and try to lobby your representatives that they won't bother to listen to you. And I've found that the complete opposite, at least at the state level, is true. Elected officials, in my experience, are desperate to hear from their constituents, particularly constituents who are not paid to have a certain point of view. If you make an effort to really speak your mind to your elected officials, whether it's at a committee hearing where there's open testimony or in a one-on-one meeting in their office, they'll probably appreciate it. Chances are they're going to listen to you. I was fighting for instant runoff voting here in Maine following the gubernatorial election, in which our governor, Paul LePage, was elected with 39% of the vote in a five-way race. Now, a lot of Democrats, for whatever reason, they see IRV as being like a Green Party issue, and that if IRV would help the Green Party, then they don't want to support it, which I think is terribly unfortunate. If they weren't playing partisan games and were actually concerned about finding a voting system that most accurately reflects the views of the people of the state, then they would support maybe not IRV, maybe approval voting, but something like it, rather than the first-past-the-post system. Now, in preparation for lobbying for a bill that would create a instant runoff voting system in the state of Maine for the gubernatorial election, I did a survey of the elected officials, and I sent them all a personal email and asked them if they would support an instant runoff voting bill. Some of the ones who were on the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee, because it's a legal affair, said no. They were Democrats. They said no, they would not support IRV. They think the system works fine the way it is right now, despite the fact that our Tea Party governor got elected with only 39% of the vote, which is by no means a majority, and by no means reflects the will of the population. While testifying on behalf of this IRV bill, I found that immediately after my presentation, that a lot of Democrats who were previous to that testimony in opposition to this bill suddenly had a change of heart and were suddenly advocating for IRV. And not because it was a partisan issue because the Republican won with only 39% of the vote, but because it was an issue about how to best accurately reflect the will of the voters, which for me was a really eye-opening experience, that there were people who were opposed to the bill previous to my even testifying. Like, in the 5 minutes that I had to testify, I had changed their mind. So, lobbying can work. You should do it. Direct action. Direct action is a form of activism that comes to mind when most people say activism. Occupations, sit-ins, etc. In terms of escalation, it's often the last form of peaceful protest. In its most broad definition, it's when you do something that directly stops something from happening, or directly starts something happening. It might be Mathis Cheroux laying down in the middle of the street outside of Fort Hood, preventing troops who are about to be deployed from being deployed. It might be members of an environmental activist group camping out in treetops to prevent them from being cut down. It might be activists like in Seattle at the 1999 World Trade Organization Summit, where they formed human chains, blocked entrances and intersections, and shut down the World Trade Organization conference. It might be activists occupying the SEC, or activists occupying Wall Street. Or it could be as small as stepping in between two people who are fighting and breaking up a fight. So to recap, the different forms of activism that you have available to you: lifestyle activism, theater activism, education, electoral activism, lobbying, and direct action. All of these are available options for you as you go out to tackle any problem that you come across. It means that you're in control of your own life, that you are participating in systems of power, that you've taken control to whatever extent possible of your own destiny, that governing is something done by you, not to you. We have a duty to fight. We have a duty to win. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our fear. I'm the punk patriot to life, liberty, and pursuit of a less fucked up government.